Supporting Israel is God's will. There is a final moral claim that some say justifies the close embrace between the United States and Israel. As discussed in more detail in Chapter 4, some evangelical Christians, especially so-called Christian Zionists, view the establishment of the Jewish state as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Genesis says that God gave Abraham and his descendants the land of Israel. By colonizing the West Bank, Jews are merely taking back what God gave them. Some Christians also see the creation of a greater Israel as a key event leading to the end-time final battle depicted in the New Testament's Book of Revelation. Both perspectives imply that Israel deserves U.S. support not because it is a democracy, an underdog, or a morally superior society, but because backing Israel is God's will. This line of argument undoubtedly appeals to some fervently religious individuals, but anticipating Armageddon is not a sound basis for making American foreign policy. Church and state are separate in the United States, and the religious opinions of any group are not supposed to determine the country's foreign policy. It is also an odd reading of Christian ethics to support the powerful Israeli state in its mistreatment of dispossessed Palestinians and its suppression of their rights. What do the American people want? The 6 moral arguments that we have just examined underpin the broader claim that the real basis of U.S. support for Israel is the American people's enduring identification with the Jewish state. Columnist Jeff Jacoby of the Boston Globe writes that solidarity with Israel is an abiding feature of American public opinion. Because the American people are pro-Israel, the American government is pro-Israel. And because Americans so strongly support Israel in its conflict with the Arabs, American policy in the Middle East is committed to Israel's defense. As Aipac spokesman Josh Block said on the eve of its 2007 policy conference, there's one issue, that is, support for the U.S. relationship with Israel, that brings everyone together. In fact, he argued that all trends indicate that Americans understand quite clearly that the basic values we celebrate are reflected in only one country in the Middle East, our ally, Israel. This claim, however widely believed, does not stand up to close inspection. There is a degree of cultural affinity between the United States and Israel based in part on the shared Judeo-Christian tradition. There is also no question that many Americans look favorably on Israel because it is a democracy, because of the history of anti-Semitism, and because they sympathize with Israel in its fight against Palestinian terrorism. But the common roots of Judaism and Christianity have hardly been a reliable source of amity between Jews and Christians in the past. Not only have Christians waged brutal wars against each other, but they have also been the primary perpetrators of violent anti-Semitism in previous centuries. And some fundamentalists, including Christian Zionists, still regard the conversion of Jews as an important evangelical objective. By itself, therefore, this cultural affinity cannot account for the consistent level of U.S. support, or even the generally favorable attitudes that many Americans express toward the Jewish state. As will become clear in later chapters, the American people are inclined to support Israel in part because its supporters in the United States cultivate sympathy by stifling criticism of Israel while simultaneously portraying it in a favorable light. Indeed, there is much more criticism of Israel's actions in Israel itself than there is in America. If there were a more open and candid discussion about what the Israelis are doing in the occupied territories, and about the real strategic value of Israel as a U.S. ally, there would be much less sympathy for Israel in the American public. Nonetheless, the degree of public support for Israel and for specific Israeli policies should not be overstated. Although the American people have favorable perceptions of Israel and clearly support the existence of a Jewish state, support for Israel is not especially deep. Most Americans also recognize that the United States pays a price for its unyielding support of Israel. For example, the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press has been asking Americans for many years whether they sympathize more with Israel or the Palestinians. There has always been much more sympathy for Israel, but from 1993 through 2006, the number went above 50% only once. It was 52% during the Second Lebanon War in 2006, and was as low as 37% in July 2005. Regarding the consequences of U.S. support for Israel, a Pew survey conducted in November 2005 found that 39% of the American public said that it was a major cause of global discontent. Among opinion leaders, the numbers were substantially higher. Indeed, 78% of members of the news media, 72% of military leaders, 72% of security experts, and 69% of foreign affairs specialists believe that backing Israel seriously damages America's image around the world. A Newsweek poll released a few weeks after the September 11 attacks found that 58% of the respondents believed that U.S. support for Israel was a factor in Osama bin Laden's decision to attack America. The American people are considerably more critical of some Israeli actions than U.S. politicians are, and the public clearly supports taking a hard-nosed approach to dealing with Israel when they think it is in the national interest to do so. As we explain in Chapter 7, a survey in the spring of 2003 showed that 60% of Americans were willing to withhold aid to Israel if it resisted U.S. pressure to settle its conflict with the Palestinians. In fact, 73% said the United States should not favor either side in the conflict. 2 years later, the Anti-Defamation League found that 78% of Americans believed that Washington should favor neither Israel nor the Palestinians. Andrew Kohut, the director of the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press, points out that average Americans see shades of gray in the Middle East conflict, and their sympathies notwithstanding, they favor a neutral role for the United States. Unlike their leaders, the American people displayed a tough-minded approach to dealing with Israel during the Lebanon War in 2006. As discussed in Chapter 11, polls showed that slightly more than half of the public thought that Israel was either equally responsible or mainly responsible for the war. And in at least 2 polls, more than half of the respondents said that the United States should not take sides. But the United States emphatically took Israel's side in Lebanon, as it has in every recent conflict involving Israel. This enthusiastic and unconditional support cannot be explained by the generally favorable opinion of Israel held by most Americans. Conclusion. The moral or strategic arguments commonly invoked by Israel's backers cannot account for America's remarkable relationship with the Jewish state over the past 3 decades. This is especially true for the post-Cold War period, when the strategic rationale largely evaporated, and the moral rationale was badly undermined by Israeli behavior in the occupied territories. Yet the relationship continued to grow and deepen. Some Americans surely do not find this situation anomalous, as they sincerely believe that there are powerful moral and strategic reasons behind U.S. support for Israel. Because the essential facts in this story are so at odds with this perspective, it is hard to imagine that the number of true believers is large enough to account for America's exceptional relationship with the Jewish state. We are left with a puzzle. Either a relatively small number of true believers are exerting a disproportionate influence on U.S. foreign policy, or they have managed to persuade lots of other people, especially key politicians and policymakers, that these flawed rationales are in fact correct. Because the strategic and moral case is increasingly weak, something else must be behind the striking pattern of ever-increasing U.S. support. We address that issue in the next chapter. Chapter 4. What is the Israel Lobby? In the United States, interest groups routinely contend to shape perceptions of the national interest and to convince legislators and presidents to adopt their preferred policies. The interplay of competing factions was famously extolled by James Madison in The Federalist No. 10, and the influence of different interest groups has long shaped various aspects of American foreign policy, including decisions for war. When a particular interest group is especially powerful or politically adept, it may influence policy in ways that are not good for the country as a whole. A tariff that shields a particular industry from foreign competition will benefit certain companies, but not the many consumers who have to pay more for that industry's goods. The National Rifle Association's success in thwarting gun control legislation undoubtedly benefits gun manufacturers and dealers, but it leaves the rest of society more vulnerable to gun-related violence. When a former lobbyist for the American Petroleum Institute becomes chief of staff at the White House's Council on Environmental Quality and uses this position to water down reports on the connection between greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, before resigning to take a job at ExxonMobil, one may reasonably worry that the oil industry is protecting its interests in ways that may harm all of us. The influence of the Israel lobby on U.S. foreign policy merits the same scrutiny as the impact of energy interests on environmental regulations, or the role of pharmaceutical companies in shaping policy on prescription drugs. We believe the activities of the groups and individuals who make up the lobby are the main reason why the United States pursues policies in the Middle East that make little sense on either strategic or moral grounds. Were it not for the lobby's efforts, the strategic and moral arguments that are commonly invoked to justify unconditional American support would be called into question more frequently, and U.S. policy in the Middle East would be significantly different than it is today. Pro-Israel forces surely believe that they are promoting policies that serve the American as well as the Israeli national interest. We disagree. Most of the policies they advocate are not in America's or Israel's interest, and both countries would be better off if the United States adopted a different approach. As we have already noted, we are not questioning American support for Israel's right to exist, because that right is clearly justified and is now endorsed by more than 160 countries around the world. What we are questioning, and what needs to be explained, is the magnitude of U.S. support for Israel and its largely unconditional nature, as described in Chapter 1, as well as the degree to which U.S. Middle East policy is conducted with Israel's welfare in mind, as explored in detail in Part 2. To begin that task, this chapter identifies the central components of the Israel lobby and describes how it has evolved over time. We also discuss why it has become so influential, especially when compared to potential competitors like the Arab lobby and the oil lobby. The following chapters describe the different strategies that have made it such a powerful interest group and a remarkably effective player in the making of U.S. Middle East policy. Defining the lobby. We use the IsraelLobby as a convenient shorthand term for the loose coalition of individuals and organizations that actively work to shape U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. The lobby is not a single unified movement with a central leadership, however, and the individuals and groups that make up this broad coalition sometimes disagree on specific policy issues. Nor is it some sort of cabal or conspiracy. On the contrary, the organizations and individuals who make up the lobby operate out in the open and in the same way that other interest groups do. Using the term IsraelLobby is itself somewhat misleading, insofar as many of the individuals and some of the groups in this loose coalition do not engage in formal lobbying activities, direct efforts to persuade elected officials. Rather, the various parts of the lobby work to influence U.S. policy in a variety of ways, much as other interest groups do. One might more accurately dub this the pro-Israel community, or even the Help Israel movement, because the range of activities that different groups undertake goes beyond simple lobbying. Nonetheless, because many of the key groups do lobby, and because the term IsraelLobby is used in common parlance, along with labels such as the farm lobby, insurance lobby, gun lobby, or other ethnic lobbies, we have chosen to employ it here. As with other special interest groups, the boundaries of the IsraelLobby cannot be identified precisely, and there will always be some borderline individuals or organizations whose position is hard to classify. It is easy to identify groups that are clearly part of the lobby, such as the Zionist Organization of America, ZOA, as well as individuals who are key members, such as Malcolm Hoenlein, Executive Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. There are also many groups that are obviously not part of the lobby, such as the National Association of Arab Americans, and individuals who should clearly be excluded as well, such as Columbia University scholar Rashid Khalidi. Nevertheless, there will always be some groups and individuals whose position is more ambiguous. Like other social and political movements, the IsraelLobby's boundaries are somewhat fuzzy. This situation highlights that the lobby is not a centralized, hierarchical organization with a defined membership. There are no membership cards or initiation rights. It has a core consisting of organizations whose declared purpose is to encourage the U.S. government and the American public to provide material aid to Israel and to support its government's policies, as well as influential individuals for whom these goals are also a top priority. The lobby, however, also draws support from a penumbra of groups and individuals who are committed to Israel and want the United States to continue supporting it, but who are not as energetically or consistently active as the groups and individuals that form the core. Thus, a lobbyist for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, Aipac, a research fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, YNEP, or the leadership of organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, and Christians United for Israel, CUFI, are part of the core, while individuals who occasionally write letters supporting Israel to their local newspaper or send checks to a pro-Israel political action committee should be seen as part of the broader network of supporters. This definition does not mean that every American with favorable attitudes toward Israel is a member of the lobby. To offer a personal illustration, the authors of this book are pro-Israel, in the sense that we support its right to exist, admire its many achievements, want its citizens to enjoy secure and prosperous lives, and believed that the United States should come to Israel's aid if its survival were in danger. But we are obviously not part of the Israel lobby, nor does it imply that every American official who supports Israel is part of the lobby either. A senator who consistently votes in favor of aid to Israel is not necessarily part of the lobby, because he or she may simply be responding to political pressure from pro-Israel interest groups. To be part of the lobby, in other words, one has to actively work to move American foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. For an organization, this pursuit must be an important part of its mission and consume a substantial percentage of its resources and agenda. For an individual, this means devoting some portion of one's professional or personal life, or in some cases substantial amounts of money, to influencing U.S. Middle East policy. A journalist or academic who sometimes covers Middle East issues and occasionally reports events that portray Israel favorably, such as New York Times reporter David Sanger or Duke University professor Bruce Gentleson, should not be seen as part of the lobby. But a journalist or scholar who predictably takes Israel's side and devotes a significant amount of his or her writing to defending steadfast U.S. support for Israel, such as Washington Post columnist Charles Krauthammer or former Princeton University historian Bernard Lewis, clearly is. Of course, the level of effort and the specific activities will vary in each case, and these various groups and individuals will not agree on every issue that affects Israel. Some individuals, such as Morton Klein of ZOA, John Hagee of CUFI, and Rael Jean Isaac of Americans for a Safe Israel, oppose a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians, and believe instead that Israel should retain all or most of the occupied territories. Others, such as Dennis Ross of YNEP and Martin Indyk of the Brookings Institution, favor a negotiated settlement and have occasionally criticized specific Israeli actions. Despite these differences, however, each of these individuals believes that the United States should give Israel substantial diplomatic, economic, and military support, even when Israel takes actions the United States opposes, and each has devoted a significant amount of his or her professional life to encouraging this sort of support. Thus, although it would clearly be wrong to think of the lobby as a single-minded monolith, much less portray it as a cabal or conspiracy, it would be equally mistaken to exclude anyone who works actively to preserve America's special relationship with the Jewish state. The role of American Jewry. The bulk of the lobby is comprised of Jewish Americans who are deeply committed to making sure that U.S. foreign policy advances what they believe to be Israel's interests. According to historian Melvin I. Urofsky, no other ethnic group in American history has so extensive an involvement with a foreign nation. Stephen T. Rosenthal agrees, writing that since 1967, there has been no other country whose citizens have been as committed to the success of another country as American Jews have been to Israel. In 1981, political scientist Robert H. Trice described the pro-Israel lobby as comprised of at least 75 separate organizations, mostly Jewish, that actively support most of the actions and policy positions of the Israeli government. The activities of these groups and individuals go beyond merely voting for pro-Israel candidates to include writing letters to politicians or news organizations, making financial contributions to pro-Israel political candidates, and giving active support to one or more pro-Israel organizations, whose leaders often contact them directly to convey their agenda. Yet the Israel lobby is not synonymous with American Jewry. and Jewish lobby is not an appropriate term for describing the various individuals and groups that work to foster U.S. support for Israel. For one thing, there is significant variation among American Jews in their depth of commitment to Israel. Roughly a third of them, in fact, do not identify Israel as a particularly salient issue. In 2004, for example, a well-regarded survey found that 36% of Jewish Americans were either not very or not at all emotionally attached to Israel. Furthermore, many American Jews who care a lot about Israel do not support the policies endorsed by the dominant organizations in the lobby, just as many gun owners do not support every policy that the NRA advocates, and not all retirees favor every position endorsed by the AARP. For example, American Jews were less enthusiastic about going to war in Iraq than the population as a whole, even though key organizations in the lobby supported the war, and they are more opposed to the war today. Finally, some of the individuals and groups that are especially vocal on Israel's behalf, such as the Christian Zionists, are not Jewish. So, while American Jews are the lobby's predominant constituency, it is more accurate to refer to this loose coalition as the Israel Lobby. It is the specific political agenda that defines the lobby, not the religious or ethnic identity of those pushing it. The attachment that many American Jews feel for Israel is not difficult to understand, and as noted in the introduction, it resembles the attitudes of other ethnic groups that retain an affinity for other countries or peoples with similar backgrounds in foreign lands. Although many Jews in the United States were ambivalent about Zionism during the movement's early years, support grew significantly after Hitler came to power in 1933, and especially after the horrors inflicted on the Jews during World War II became widely known. Relatively few Jews chose to leave the United States and move to Israel after its founding in 1948. A pattern that Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and other Israeli leaders initially criticized. Nevertheless, a strong commitment to Israel soon became an important element of identity for many American Jews. The establishment of a Jewish state in historic Palestine seemed miraculous in itself, especially in the aftermath of the Nazi Holocaust. Israel's achievements in making the desert bloom were an obvious source of pride, and a close identification with Israel provided a new basis for community for a population that was rapidly assimilating into American society and becoming increasingly secular at the same time. As Rosenthal notes, to equate Israel with Judaism was a comforting way to avoid the encumbrances of religion by focusing one's Jewishness on a secular state 8,000 miles from home. Synagogues, the new mainstay of American Jewish life in the post-war era, became Israel-centered. A new class of Jewish professionals arose in the suburbs. They soon discovered that Israel was the most effective means to counter the growing religious indifference of their constituencies. Primarily in response to Israel's overwhelming need for financial and political support, new institutions arose, and fundraising and lobbying increasingly defined American Jews' relationship to Israel. American Jews have formed an impressive array of civic organizations whose agendas include working to benefit Israel, in many cases by influencing U.S. foreign policy. Key organizations include Aipac, the American Jewish Congress, ZOA, the Israel-Policy Forum, IPF, the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, Americans for a Safe Israel, American Friends of Likud, Merkaz USA, Hadassah, and many others. Indeed, sociologist Chaim I. Waxman reported in 1992 that the American Jewish Yearbook listed more than 80 national Jewish organizations specifically devoted to Zionist and pro-Israel activities, and for many others, objectives and activities such as promotes Israel's welfare, support for the State of Israel, and promotes understanding of Israel, appear with impressive frequency. 51 of the largest and most important organizations come together in the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, whose self-described mission includes forging diverse groups into a unified force for Israel's well-being and working to strengthen and foster the special U.S.-Israel relationship. The lobby also includes think tanks such as the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, JINSA, the Middle East Forum, MEF, and YNEP, as well as individuals who work in universities and other research organizations. There are also dozens of pro-Israel PACs ready to funnel money to pro-Israel political candidates or to candidates whose opponents are deemed either insufficiently supportive of or hostile to Israel. The Center for Responsive Politics, a nonpartisan research group that tracks campaign contributions, has identified roughly 36 such pro-Israel PACs, many of them stealth PACs whose names do not reveal a pro-Israel orientation, and reports that these organizations contributed approximately $3 million to congressional candidates in the 2006 midterm election. Of the various Jewish organizations that include foreign policy as a central part of their agenda, Aipac is clearly the most important and best known. In 1997, when Fortune magazine asked members of Congress and their staffs to list the most powerful lobbies in Washington, Aipac came in second behind AARP, but ahead of heavyweight lobbies like the AFL-CIO and the NRA. A National Journal study in March 2005 reached a similar conclusion, placing Aipac in second place, tied with AARP, in Washington's muscle rankings. Former Congressman Mervyn Dimely, Democrat California, once called Aipac, without question, the most effective lobby in Congress. And the former chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Lee Hamilton, who served in Congress for 34 years, said in 1991, "There's no lobby group that matches it. They're in a class by themselves." The influence that groups like Aipac now enjoy did not emerge overnight. During Zionism's early years, and even after Israel's founding, lobbying on Israel's behalf tended to occur quietly behind the scenes and usually depended on personal contacts between influential government officials, especially the president and a small number of Jewish leaders, pro-Zionist advisors, or Jewish friends. For example, Woodrow Wilson's support for the Balfour Declaration in 1917 was due in part to the influence of his Jewish friends, Supreme Court Justice Louis D. Brandeis and Rabbi Stephen Wise. Similarly, Harry S. Truman's decision to back Israel's creation and to recognize the new state was influenced, though not determined, by intercessions from Jewish friends and advisors. The tendency for Israel's supporters to keep a low profile reflected concerns about lingering anti-Semitism in the United States, as well as the fear that overt lobbying on Israel's behalf would expose American Jews to the charge of dual loyalty. Aipac itself had explicitly Zionist roots. Its founder, I.L. Cy Kennan, was head of the American Zionist Council in 1951, which was a registered foreign lobbying group. Kennan reorganized it as a U.S. lobbying organization, the American Zionist Committee for Public Affairs, in 1953-54, and the new organization was renamed Aipac in 1959. Kennan relied on personal contacts with key legislators rather than public campaigns or mass mobilization, and Aipac generally followed Kennan's rules to advance Israel's cause. Rule number 1 was, get behind legislation, don't step out in front of it. That is, keep a low profile. According to J.J. Goldberg, the editor of the Jewish newspaper Forward, Zionist influence increased exponentially during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations because the affluence and influence of Jews in American society had increased, and also because Kennedy and Johnson counted numerous Jews among their close advisors, donors, and personal friends. Aipac was still a small operation with a modest staff and budget, and as Stuart Eisenstadt points out, not until the mid-1960s did overt, organized Jewish political activity on behalf of the State of Israel come into its own. The lobby's size, wealth, and influence grew substantially after the Six-Day War in June 1967. According to Eisenstadt, that conflict galvanized the American Jewish public like no event since Israel's War of Independence. The sense of pride in new Jews, proud, strong, capable of defending themselves, had an incalculable effect on American Jewry. The successful campaign against anti-Semitism, aided by the widespread awareness of the horrors of the Holocaust, helped remove lingering discriminatory barriers, and Jewish Americans lost the sense of fear that had stunted their political will in earlier years. And because Israel was becoming a central focus of Jewish identity in a world where assimilation was increasingly viable and widespread, there were few reasons not to express that attachment in politics. The heightened concern with Israel's well-being within Jewish organizations continued during the War of Attrition, 1969-70, and the October War, 1973. These conflicts reinforced pride in Israel's military prowess, but they also raised fears about Israel's security, thereby reinforcing the Israel-centric focus of many Jewish community relations groups. Albert Chernin, the executive director of the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council, later renamed the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, expressed this perspective in 1978 when he said that our first priority is Israel, of course, reflecting the complete identity of views of the American Jewish leadership with the concerns of the rank and file. Historian Jack Wertheimer terms this comment a stunning admission that political efforts to shore up Israel superseded all other concerns of Jewish community relations organizations in the United States. As American foreign aid to Israel began to exceed private contributions, pro-Israel organizations increasingly focused on political activities intended to preserve or increase U.S. governmental support. According to Wertheimer, the overall responsibility for lobbying for Israel was assumed by the Conference of Presidents and Aipac. Both had been founded in the 1950s and had played a modest role prior to 1967. The needs of Israel for political support catapulted these two organizations to prominence in the 1970s and 1980s. This increased effort reflected awareness that backing Israel was costly for the United States and therefore had to be justified and defended in the political sphere. As Morris Amate, who replaced Kennan as Aipac's executive director in 1975, put it, "The name of the game, if you want to help Israel, is political action." Under Amate and his successor, Tom Dine, Aipac was transformed from an intimate, low-budget operation into a large, mass-based organization with a staff of more than 150 employees and an annual budget derived solely from private contributions that went from some $300,000 in 1973 to an estimated $40 to $60 million today. Instead of shunning the limelight, as it had done under Kennan, Aipac increasingly sought to advertise its power. According to one former staffer, the theory was no one is scared of you if they don't know about you. In contrast to the earlier patterns of intimate lobbying on behalf of Jews by Jewish advisors and sympathetic Gentiles, Aipac and other groups in the lobby did not define their public agenda as humanitarian support for Jews in Israel. Rather, the evolution of the lobby increasingly involved the formulation and promotion of sophisticated arguments about the alignment of America's and Israel's strategic interests and moral values. Flush with cash and well-positioned in the Cold War political landscape, Aipac's political muscle was enhanced by new federal rules on campaign financing, which triggered the creation of independent PACs and made it easier to channel money toward pro-Israel candidates. Aipac may not have been all that formidable in the early 1960s, but by the 1980s, notes Warren Bass, it was a Washington powerhouse. Unity in diversity and the norm against dissent. As noted above, the lobby is not a centralized hierarchical movement. Even within the Jewish elements of the lobby, there are important differences on specific policy issues. In recent years, Aipac and the Conference of Presidents have tilted toward Likud and other hardline parties in Israel and were skeptical about the Oslo peace process, a phenomenon we discuss at greater length below. While a number of other smaller groups, such as Amenu, Americans for Peace Now, Brit Tzedek V'Shalom, Jewish Alliance for Justice and Peace, Israel Policy Forum, Jewish Voice for Peace, Meretz USA, and the Tikkun community, strongly favor a two-state solution and believe Israel needs to make significant concessions in order to bring it about. These differences have occasionally led to rifts within or among these different organizations. In 2006, for example, the Israel Policy Forum, Americans for Peace Now, Jewish Voice for Peace, and Brit Tzedek V'Shalom openly opposed an Aipac-sponsored congressional resolution, H.R. 4681, that would have imposed even more draconian restrictions on aid to the Palestinians than the Israeli government sought. A watered-down version of the resolution passed by a comfortable margin, but the episode reminds us that pro-Israel groups do not form a monolith with a single party line. These divisions notwithstanding, the majority of organized groups in the American Jewish community, especially the largest and wealthiest among them, continue to favor steadfast U.S. support for Israel no matter what policies the Jewish state pursues. As an Aipac spokesman explained in June 2000, when concerns about Israel's arms sales to China led to calls for a reduction in U.S. support, we are opposed to linking Israel's aid under any circumstances because, once it starts, it never stops. Even the dovish Americans for Peace Now supports robust U.S. economic and military assistance to Israel, opposes calls to cut or condition U.S. aid, and seeks only to prevent U.S. aid from being used to support settlement activities in the occupied territories. Similarly, the moderate Israel-Policy Forum does not advocate making American aid more conditional, but rather focuses its efforts on persuading the U.S. government to work more actively and effectively for a two-state solution. Despite differences on the peace process and related issues, in short, almost every pro-Israel group wants to keep the special relationship intact. A notable exception is Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, which has called for the U.S. government to suspend military aid to Israel until it ends the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Indeed, given this position, one might argue that JVP is not part of the lobby at all. Given their desire to maximize U.S. backing, Israeli officials frequently engage American Jewish leaders and ask them to help mobilize support in the United States for particular Israeli policies. As Rabbi Alexander Schindler, former chair of the Conference of Presidents, told an Israeli magazine in 1976, the President's Conference and its members have been instruments of official governmental Israeli policy. It was seen as our task to receive directions from government circles and to do our best, no matter what, to affect the Jewish community. Schindler thought this situation was not acceptable, telling the interviewer that American Jewry is in no mood to be used by anyone. Yet Albert Chernin of NJCRAC offered a similar appraisal in the 1970s, saying that in domestic areas we made policy, but in Israel affairs the policy was a given. In reality, the Conference of Presidents was the vehicle through which Israel communicated its policy to the community. Ori Nir of The Forward quotes an unnamed activist with a major Jewish organization claiming in 2005 that it is routine for us to say, this is our policy on a certain issue, but we must check what the Israelis think. We, as a community, do it all the time. Or, as Hyman Bookbinder, a high-ranking official of the American Jewish Committee, once admitted, unless something is terribly pressing, really critical, or fundamental, you parrot Israel's line in order to retain American support. As American Jews, we don't go around saying Israel is wrong about its policies. Israel's ability to galvanize support within the United States has been demonstrated on numerous occasions. Zionist and later Israeli officials encouraged American Jewish leaders to campaign for the UN partition plan in 1947 and for U.S. recognition in 1948, and to lobby against the abortive peace plan formulated by UN mediator Folke Bernadotte in 1948. Coordinated efforts such as these also helped convince the Truman administration to significantly increase economic aid to Israel in 1952, and to abandon a Pentagon and State Department proposal for a $10 million grant of military assistance to Egypt. During the crisis preceding the 1967 Six-Day War, the Israeli government instructed its ambassador in Washington to create a public atmosphere that will constitute pressure on the Johnson administration, without it being explicitly clear that we are behind this public campaign. The effort involved getting sympathetic Americans to write letters, editorials, telegrams, and public statements, etc., in a variety of styles, whose purpose, according to the Israeli Foreign Ministry, was to create a public atmosphere that will strengthen our friends within the administration. White House officials eventually asked their Israeli counterparts to shut down the letter-writing campaign, but the Israeli ambassador reported back to Jerusalem that, of course, we are continuing it. According to historian Tom Segeyev, the White House was inundated with letters from citizens calling on the president to stand by Israel. This tendency to reflexively support Israel's actions may be less prevalent today, but major organizations in the lobby still defer to the preferences of Israel's leaders on many occasions. Following the release of the Bush administration's Roadmap for Middle East Peace in March 2003, for example, Malcolm Hoenlein of the Conference of Presidents reportedly told Haaretz that if the Israeli government expressed reservations about the roadmap, it would have the support of the Jewish community. And, Hoenlein emphasized, we will not hesitate to make our voice heard. Despite the fissures that have emerged between the Israeli government and some groups within American Jewry, this community has generally accepted the principle that on matters of fundamental security there ought to be no public criticism of Israel. According to Stephen Rosenthal, for millions of American Jews, criticism of Israel was a worse sin than marrying out of the faith. Or, as Bookbinder once acknowledged, there is a feeling of guilt as to whether Jews should double-check the Israeli government. They automatically fall into line for that very reason. Recent surveys of American Jewish opinion reveal that roughly two-thirds of the respondents agree that, regardless of their individual views on the peace negotiations with the Arabs, American Jews should support the policies of the duly elected government of Israel. Thus, even when both leaders and rank and file of important Jewish American organizations have serious reservations about Israeli policy, they rarely call for the U.S. government to put significant pressure on the Israeli government. The norm against public criticism has been vividly illustrated on a number of occasions over the past several decades. In 1973, for example, a group of progressive American Jews formed a new organization, BRERA, Alternative, which called for more open discussion between Israel and the diaspora and sought to mobilize support for withdrawal from the occupied territories and a peace settlement with the Palestinians. In addition to making their views publicly known through advertisements in major American newspapers, several BRERA leaders were part of a delegation of American Jews who met in a private capacity with a group of Palestinian representatives under the auspices of the American Friends Service Committee. Although a few Jewish leaders defended BRERA, a powerful backlash soon emerged from the major Jewish organizations. Aipac's Near East report accused BRERA of undermining support for Israel, and the president of the Reform Rabbinate, Arthur Lelyveld, said that groups like BRERA gave aid and comfort to those who would cut aid to Israel and leave it defenseless before murderers and terrorists. A Hadassah newsletter labeled BRERA members cheerleaders for defeatism and warned its own members to reject the advances of these organizations with their dogmas that run counter to Israeli security and Jewish survival. The president of the Conservative Rabbinical Assembly declared that BRERA was fronting for the PLO, and 47 rabbis issued a statement terming BRERA's positions practically identical with the Arab point of view. The pro-settlement group Americans for a Safe Israel distributed a 30-page pamphlet smearing BRERA's leaders for their involvement with other left-wing causes and referring to them as Jews for Fatah. Not to be outdone, the Zoa magazine, American Zionist, accused BRERA of abusing the right of free speech, warning that the Jews who cry foul in public must realize the treacherous consequences of their efforts. Ramifications are felt not by them, but by fellow Jews thousands of miles away. In the face of this assault, BRERA stood little chance of building a following or establishing a more open climate for discussion. Local community groups excluded BRERA representatives, and the Jewish Community Council of New Haven agreed to admit the local BRERA chapter only on the condition that it confine its criticism within the community. An internal memorandum prepared by the American Jewish Committee recommended co-opting the group, but only if it agreed to direct the exposition of their different views on sensitive Israel diaspora issues to the Jewish community itself and refrain from appealing to the general public. Unable to attract sustained funding and weakened by leadership defections, BRERA disbanded after 5 years. In response to the BRERA controversy, organizations like the Conference of Presidents, the Synagogue Council of America, the American Jewish Committee, and NJCRAC conducted internal studies or public inquiries on the proper place of dissent. According to J.J. Goldberg, all these organizations reached the same conclusion. American Jews had the right to discuss issues freely, but only within discrete forums outside public view. In 1976, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Simcha Dinitz, working with representatives from NJCRAC and the Conference of Presidents, developed a set of principles to guide behavior within the Jewish community. The first principle, Goldberg notes, was that Israelis were the only ones entitled to decide Israeli policy, and the second was that American Jews should stand publicly united with Israel and air disputes only in private. By the 1970s, writes Edward Tivnan, total support of Israel had become a requirement of leadership in local Jewish communities throughout America. The norm against public criticism of Israeli policy remains, for the most part, intact. In October 1996, for example, the president of ZOA, Morton Klein, sent a letter to ADL head Abraham Foxman protesting an invitation to New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman to speak at an ADL dinner, charging that Friedman regularly defames Israel and its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Klein then circulated the letter to an array of officials at the Conference of Presidents, leading Foxman to denounce him as a thought policeman. The dispute intensified when David Bar-Ilan, Netanyahu's director of communications, weighed in and declared that Friedman should not be given a platform by any organization that purports to be Zionist. Though sometimes critical of certain Israeli policies, Friedman is hardly anti-Israel, and Foxman himself is one of Israel's most ardent defenders. But Klein's response shows how deep the opposition to open discussion runs. A few years later, Edgar Bronfman Sr., then president of the World Jewish Congress, was accused of perfidy when he wrote a letter to President Bush urging him to pressure Israel to curb construction of its controversial security fence. The executive vice president of the Congress, Izzy Liebler, declared that it would be obscene at any time for the president of the World Jewish Congress to lobby the president of the United States to resist policies being promoted by the government of Israel. Liebler and others were similarly incensed 2 years later when the president of the moderate Israel-Policy Forum, Seymour Reich, advised Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to pressure Israel to reopen a critical border crossing in the Gaza Strip in November 2005. Reich's advice to Rice was reasonable and well-intentioned, but Liebler denounced his action as irresponsible behavior, and the president of the Orthodox Union, Stephen Savitsky, said it was not only disrespectful to Israel's government, but offensive to millions of American Jews who categorically reject such an approach. Liebler also warned, "There is obviously something sick in the state of world Jewry when purportedly mainstream leaders feel that they can lobby freely against the security policies of the democratically elected government of Israel. If this sort of behavior is to be tolerated, we may as well write off our one remaining ally, Diaspora Jewry." Recoiling from these attacks, Reich announced that the word pressure is not in my vocabulary when it comes to Israel. The reluctance to criticize Israel's policies openly is not difficult to fathom. In addition to the obvious desire not to say anything that might aid Israel's enemies, groups or individuals who criticize Israeli policy or the U.S.-Israel relationship are likely to find it harder to retain support and raise funds within the Jewish community. They also run the risk of being ostracized by the larger mainstream organizations. Although groups like Americans for Peace Now, the Tikkun Community, the Israel-Policy Forum, and the New Israel Fund have endured and thrived where Brera did not, other progressive Jewish groups, such as New Jewish Agenda, encountered the same opposition that Brera had faced and lasted little more than a decade. Similarly, although Americans for Peace Now was eventually admitted to the Conference of Presidents in 1993 after a contentious struggle, the progressive Meretz USA and the liberal Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association were denied membership in 2002 despite support from moderate groups within the conference. On a smaller scale, Jewish Voice for Peace was denied a booth at a major Jewish community event in the San Francisco area on the grounds that it was insufficiently supportive of Israel. And the Hillel chapter at the University of Texas refused to give an organization called Jewish Students for Palestinian Rights space to conduct a study group. Efforts to marginalize dissenting Jewish voices continue to this day. When the Union of Progressive Zionists, UPZ, sponsored campus appearances in 2006 by Breaking the Silence, an organization of former Israeli soldiers that is critical of IDF operations in the occupied territories, ZOA denounced UPZ and demanded that it be expelled from the Israel on Campus Coalition, ICC, a network of pro-Israel groups that includes Aipac and the ADL. According to Zoa's Klein, sponsoring groups that are critical of Israel is not the mission of the ICC. UPZ's director emphasized the group's love for Israel, other groups rallied to its defense, and the ICC steering committee unanimously rejected Zoa's demand. Undeterred, Klein denounced the members of the steering committee and said, "Their mission includes fighting incitement, and yet we are astonished that they would ignore this incitement by Israelis against Israel." ZOA also issued a press release urging member organizations in the ICC to change their votes. The press release quoted an Israeli Foreign Ministry report saying, "The willingness of Jewish communities to host these organizations and even sponsor them is unfortunate. Their negative effect on Israel's image must be stopped." At least one Orthodox group on the ICC steering committee subsequently announced it was now in favor of removing the UPZ. The lobby moves right. Most American Jews have long supported liberal causes and the Democratic Party, and a majority of them favors a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Nonetheless, some of the most important groups in the lobby, including Aipac and the Conference of Presidents, have become increasingly conservative over time and are now led by hardliners who support the positions of their hawkish counterparts in Israel. As J.J. Goldberg chronicles in his important book, Jewish Power, the Six-Day War and its aftermath brought into prominence a group of new Jews drawn disproportionately from hardline Zionist, Orthodox, and neoconservative circles. Their defiance was so strident and their anger so intense, he writes, that the rest of the Jewish community respectfully stood back and let the new Jews take the lead. The minority was permitted to speak for the mass and become the dominant voice of Jewish politics. This trend was reinforced by the campaign on behalf of the 1974 Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which linked most favored nation trading status for the Soviet Union to Moscow's willingness to permit greater Jewish emigration, by the emergence and growth of the so-called neoconservative movement, see below, and by the Likud Party's successful effort to cultivate and strengthen hardline support in key pro-Israel organizations during the years when Likud was sharing power with Israel's Labor Party. According to Goldberg, the genius of Shamir's strategy was to manipulate the central bodies of Jewish representation so that, without taking sides, they became voices for the Likud half of the government. Likud Party officials, including Prime Minister Shamir's Chief of Staff Yossi Ben Aharon, worked to ensure that the Conference of Presidents was chaired by more conservative officials, and also helped engineer the selection of Malcolm Hoenlein as executive vice chairman of the conference in 1986. More hardline groups were given greater access and attention by Israeli leaders, which reinforced the perception that they were the authoritative voices of the Jewish community. As an advisor to Labor Party leader Shimon Peres later admitted, "Ignoring American Jewry was one of the biggest mistakes we made. We let Shamir's people do whatever they wanted." This rightward shift also reflects the way decisions are made in some key organizations in the lobby, as well as the growing influence of a small number of wealthy conservatives who increasingly dominate organizations like Aipac. There are more than 50 organizations represented in the Conference of Presidents, for example, and each has a single vote regardless of size. But, as Michael Massing points out, smaller conservative groups in the conference decisively outnumber the larger liberal ones, and so can neutralize their influence. And that leaves considerable discretion in the hands of Executive Vice Chairman Malcolm Hoenlein, who is a longtime supporter of Israel's settler movement and was deeply skeptical about the Oslo peace process. Similarly, membership on Aipac's board of directors is based on each director's financial contributions, not, observes Massing, on how well they represent Aipac's members. The individuals willing to give the largest amounts to Aipac and to sympathetic politicians tend to be the most zealous defenders of Israel, and Aipac's top leadership, consisting primarily of former presidents of the organization, is considerably more hawkish on Middle East issues than are most Jewish Americans. Although Aipac formally endorsed the Oslo peace process in 1993, it did little to make it work, and dropped its opposition to a Palestinian state without endorsing the idea only after Ehud Barak became prime minister in 1999. Indeed, Aipac and other hardline groups have occasionally backed more extreme positions than those favored by the Israeli government. In 1994, for example, the hawkish ZOA successfully lobbied for an amendment to the foreign aid bill that placed additional restrictions on U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority, even though both the Clinton administration and the Rabin government in Israel opposed the measure. The Conference of Presidents never endorsed the Oslo peace process, and Aipac helped sponsor the 1995 Jerusalem Embassy Act, a transparent attempt to disrupt the peace process by requiring the United States to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Indeed, the key donors that form Aipac's inner circle reportedly ousted Executive Director Tom Dine because his views were insufficiently hawkish. In addition to this tendency for those with more extreme views to back and dominate key organizations in the lobby, there is another reason that many pro-Israel groups have moved rightward, to keep contributions flowing in. As Waxman notes, many American Jewish organizations now need Israel to legitimate their own existence. Although these organizations may have been established for the purpose of enhancing and strengthening Israel, today Israel is vital for their continued viability. Portraying Israel as beleaguered and vulnerable and issuing dire warnings about continued or growing anti-Semitism helps maintain a high level of concern among potential supporters, and thus helps ensure these organizations' continued existence. Writing in 1992, Jonathan Wucher of the Jewish Education Service of North America made precisely this point. We have seen the emergence of a whole new industry in America, of organizations monitoring and purporting to fight anti-Semitism everywhere in the world. The success of the Simon Wiesenthal Center has been particularly striking. It has become a major direct mail fundraising enterprise by outflanking even the ADL in the hunt for anti-Semitic threats to Jewish security. It is sadly not uncommon today to see organizations jockeying for position in a context to determine who among them is toughest in fighting anti-Semitism that is waged in the Jewish press and barrages of direct mail appeals. Or, as Thomas Friedman of the New York Times remarked 3 years later, ever since Mr. Rabin and Mr. Arafat shook hands, they have received only the most tepid support from mainstream American Jewish groups, like the Conference of Presidents, and outright hostility from the Orthodox and fringe Jewish groupings. It is as if these organizations can only thrive if they have an enemy, someone to fight. It bears repeating that a number of groups in the American Jewish community are critical of certain Israeli policies, and especially its continued presence in the occupied territories. Some of these organizations, such as the Israel Policy Forum or Brit Tzedek V'Shalom, actively promote U.S. engagement in the peace process and have been able to win some minor legislative victories in recent years. Yet such groups lack the financial resources and the influence of Aipac, the ADL, ZOA, or the Conference of Presidents, whose right-of-center views are unfortunately taken by politicians, policymakers, and the media to be the representative voice of American Jewry. For the moment, therefore, the major organizations in the lobby will continue to advocate policy positions at odds with many of the people in whose name they claim to speak. The role of the neoconservatives. The lobby's drift to the right has been reinforced by the emergence of the neoconservatives. The neoconservative movement has been an important part of American intellectual and political life since the 1970s, but it has drawn particular attention since September 11. This group has been prominent in shaping the Bush administration's unilateralist foreign policy, and especially the ill-fated decision to invade Iraq in March 2003. Neoconservatism is a political ideology with distinct views on both domestic and foreign policy, although only the latter is relevant here. Most neoconservatives extol the virtues of American hegemony, and sometimes even the idea of an American empire, and they believe U.S. power should be used to encourage the spread of democracy and discourage potential rivals from even trying to compete with the United States. In their view, spreading democracy and preserving U.S. dominance is the best route to long-term peace. Neoconservatives also believe that America's democratic system ensures that it will be seen as a benign hegemon by most other countries, and that U.S. leadership will be welcomed provided it is exercised decisively. They tend to be skeptical of international institutions, especially the UN, which they regard as both anti-Israel and as a constraint on America's freedom of action, and wary of many allies, especially the Europeans, whom they see as idealistic pacifists free-riding on the Pax Americana. Viewing U.S. leadership as good both for America and for the world, to quote the website of the neoconservative Project for New American Century, neoconservatives generally favor the unilateral exercise of American power instead. Very importantly, neoconservatives believe that military force is an extremely useful tool for shaping the world in ways that will benefit America. If the United States demonstrates its military prowess and shows that it is willing to use the power at its disposal, then allies will follow our lead, and potential adversaries will realize it is futile to resist and will decide to bandwagon with the United States. Neoconservatism, in short, is an especially hawkish political ideology. Neoconservatives occupy influential positions at a variety of organizations and institutions. Prominent neoconservatives include former and present policymakers like Elliott Abrams, Kenneth Edelman, William Bennett, John Bolton, Douglas Feith, the late Jeane Kirkpatrick, I. Louis Scooter Libby, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, James Woolsey, and David Wormser. Journalists like the late Robert Bartley, David Brooks, Charles Krauthammer, William Crystal, Bret Stephens, and Norman Podhoretz. Academics like Fuad Ajami, Elliot Cohen, Aaron Friedberg, Bernard Lewis, and Ruth Wedgwood. And think tank pundits like Max Boot, David Frum, Ruel Mark Jurek, Robert Kagan, Michael Ledeen, Joshua Moravchik, Daniel Pipes, Daniela Pletka, Michael Rubin, and Meyrav Wormser. The leading neoconservative magazines and newspapers are Commentary, The New York Sun, The Wall Street Journal op-ed page, and The Weekly Standard. The think tanks and advocacy groups most closely associated with these neoconservatives are the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, the Center for Security Policy, CSP, the Hudson Institute, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, JINSA, the Middle East Forum, MEF, the Project for a New American Century, PNAC, and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, WINEP. Virtually all conservatives are similar to Israel, a point they emphasize openly and unapologetically. According to Walt, a leading conservative pundit, supporting Israel is a key tenet of neoconservatism, a position he attributes to shared liberal democratic values. Benjamin Ginsberg, a political scientist who has written extensively about American politics as well as anti-Semitism, convincingly argues that one of the main reasons that the neoconservatives moved to the right was their attachment to Israel and their growing frustration during the 1960s with a Democratic Party that was becoming increasingly opposed to American military preparedness and increasingly enamored of Third World causes. In particular, writes Ginsberg, they embraced Ronald Reagan's hardline anti-communism because they saw it as a political movement that would guarantee Israel's security.